Welcome to this Prevention Practitioners Network workshop. The focus of this workshop today is pivoting to philanthropic funding. And we're going to focus on 5 different areas of this pivot that were raised by members of the Prevention Practitioners Network at our workshop in the fall. Those include making and facilitating introductions, translating your work into grant language, aligning your mission with philanthropic priorities, gauging your likelihood of success, when do you apply, and your actual submission, submitting response to an RFP, submitting a letter of inquiry, or submitting a proposal itself. So, based on the poll, the live Zoom poll that we just conducted, it seems like there's the most interest or most discomfort with making and facilitating introductions, followed closely by gauging your likelihood of success, aligning with philanthropic priorities, submitting proposals, and thankfully most of you feel pretty confident about translating your work into grant language. It is my pleasure to introduce 2 friends and colleagues, Allie Quick and Hannah Mayer. I am going to let each of them introduce themselves in turn. Allie, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I am Allie Quick, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. I am a career fundraiser. I've spent my entire life fundraising for nonprofits and have my own consultancy here in the Pittsburgh market. I'm thrilled to be working alongside Eradicate Hate over the course of the last 2 years, and I'm happy to be here. So feel free, I'll put my contact information in the chat, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions following today.
Hannah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I am Hannah Mayer. I am a grant writer. I've worked with a handful of organizations, and over the past year, like Allie, have worked with Eradicate Hate, a fantastic organization, which I'm so happy to be working with. Unlike Allie, I am relatively new to the space with a few years of experience. So I am learning alongside all of you, but I am happy to be here today to share my knowledge and what I've learned.
All right, and our format today is largely going to be informal fireside chat. By all means, if you have questions, dive in. One of the things that I love most about these Prevention Practitioners Network workshops is there tends to be a dialogue and lots of really rich questions. So do not hesitate. Neil and team, if there are questions that I am missing in the chat, don't be shy about raising them, but others can raise their hands too. So I'm going to start with questions that we prepared based on our last workshop of what people were interested in. And I just want Hannah and Allie, if you can help me define terms for people. What's the difference between a grant and a gift?
So typically, a grant will refer to something for which there is a contract and a responsibility for accountability at the back end, typically coming from government, foundation, perhaps even corporate entities. A gift typically comes from individuals and has fewer strings attached, and is something that is less structured, I would say. So that would be my take on it. Hannah, if you have anything else to add.
And just echoing Allie, for the purposes of this conversation, a grant is when we're talking about writing and submitting proposals, which is more frequent than it would be for a gift, and also filling out follow-up reports and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are working in a university setting, this really matters because there's frequently very different indirect cost arrangements for grants versus gifts. Mm-hmm. So knowing which realm you're in can really be helpful if you're submitting deliverables, timetables, budget. you're probably in grant territory rather than gift territory.
Mhm.
All right. So where do people go to find money? What are some of the market trends that we're seeing with philanthropic organizations and their funders, Allie?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note first that all of the data from last year, from 2025, is still being captured and will be reported out. So we'll have a real sense of what's happening in the landscape in the coming month or so. That being said, I think that it's important to show that last year's data, 2024, was a dramatic increase. $592 billion being given. Individual giving continues to be the largest source of that. And I think that's an important thing to note for those of you that are stepping into the space, that the relationships with individuals and securing those funds can be really critical to helping meet your numbers. Corporate giving continues to increase, slower, but increasing. And I anticipate that will be the same case in 2025 as it was in 24. And foundation giving did not increase. It was flat when adjusted for inflation. So people tend to think of the foundation community as the best place to start. And I think it's got to be a combination of the three and the ability to navigate between those three in a comfortable way for your organization. One thing I would also note is that there were some really interesting trends at the end of the year. Year-end giving tends to be when most people are making a gift. And the year-end giving was showing really lagging numbers this year. And so some of it they are attributing to the fact that people are starting to make gifts more consistently throughout the year, as opposed to waiting just till year-end. And the fact that there have been so many political, urgent issues that have arisen over the course of 2025, that people were spreading their gifts out and making gifts in the moment as opposed to waiting until year end. So I'll be curious to see if that holds true when the new data comes out. But overall giving for 25 is up. We know that. It's up currently over 7% from previous year, but we'll see where it lands.
Allie, one of the things we encountered last year, and I'm curious if this is true across the industry, is funders saying we're not considering new applicants because we want to focus our resources on existing organizations we fund in the context of them losing federal funding. Do you see that broadly across the landscape, or was that kind of isolated anecdata that we experienced?
It's absolutely consistent across all organizations. All the clients that I'm working with, everybody's in the same situation. So there was the urgency to circle up with the folks who were funding you to ask them to help fill the gap. And there was also the need to be forging those new relationships in order to build the pipeline when those funders are ready to take on new funding organizations.
So if you never approached philanthropic funding before, or if you need to get creative because your existing sources aren't enough to fill the gap, where do you look? Where do you look to find information on funders?
Yeah. Do you want me to start on that, Hannah, or you want to?
Yeah, why don't you start and I'll take over after.
Okay. And I should emphasize the majority of my fundraising career was focused in the individual giving space. I've done a fair amount of corporate and foundation as well, but if you hear me leaning in that direction, that's why. So obviously, I'm a firm believer that the first place you look is within your current database. Your current donors, regardless of what they're currently giving, are your best potential for being able to move the needle in a timely manner. So if you have an existing constituency, starting there and making sure that you're engaging in conversations, sharing stories of impact, continuing to not only build but maintain those relationships and share the urgency of your financial situation, whatever that might be, with your current database. So I'm a firm believer, start at home first, and go, outward from there. Depending on your market, there are numerous funding groups and circles that you can be reaching out to, whether you have a community foundation or a funders network that will be able to help you identify who the funders are within your landscape, or are particularly associated with your mission. And those organizations are really willing to help nonprofits navigate that. If you don't have those resources, if you don't have a staff person who's able to dedicate time to that, I would encourage you to think about starting there.
Yeah, and before I go into, sorry, Brett, did you want
No,
to?
I think you're about to answer my next question, Hannah, so dive in.
Okay. So before I go into how this might look from someone on the grant writing side, I just want to emphasize a point that Ali made about looking to funders networks as a place to help get connected with funders. So funders networks are often grouped by region or mission or themes. So you can really find one that fits what your organization does or where you are located. And I know Neil is going to follow up at the end of this workshop with some resources, and Ali and I have provided some examples of some of those funders networks for you all to kind of get an idea of what that looks like. So going into identifying funding from the grant writing side, right? Ali is very much in the weeds with funders, building relationships with them. I'm not as much so. So what I like to do to find open RFPs or opportunities for funding is to look at databases. So I'm subscribed to Candid, and on Candid, you can fill in your organization's location and what you do, and you can get funding updates from them when there are open RFPs that might fit what your organization is looking for. So that is just one example. And again, doubling down on those resources, Ali and I have compiled a list with some free and some paid databases where you can find these RFPs and open funding requests. And those are great places to look. And, that's where I found some open funding requests that we have actually applied for. So
I will say, and I just want to be vulnerable in quantifying this, our success rate where we have a relationship versus our success rate applying blind to an RFP where we don't have a relationship is dramatically different. So to Ali's point, start at home, start with the people you know. But a lot of people, when we did the quiz at the top, said making facilitating introductions is the thing they're least comfortable with. How do you actually get your foot in the door? Especially when so many foundations, at least, are invitation only. So how do you reach out to people and ask them for connections? How do you leverage relationships with funders who aren't able to fund you?
Yeah, so I'm going to say at the top of this, I realize that like most people aren't comfortable with this piece of it. It can be very daunting to think about cold calling or sitting down and asking for money. We're all, brought up not to talk about salaries over the dinner table, but yet here we are, being asked to go out and talk to people about how much they can donate to your organization. I like to remind people you only have to be gutsy 5 seconds at a time. And just remembering at every step through the cultivation process that it just takes 5 seconds to either pick up the phone and make the call or to ask the awkward question. And so in this case, just getting started with the introductions can be really uncomfortable for many. obviously leaning into your board and your current donors and just having conversations about who they know and how they can connect to you, and if they're willing to do that directly or indirectly, is really key. My experience is that most foundation gift officers and most, I'm going to call them, CSR, corporate social responsibility folks that are in the corporate space overseeing philanthropy, are open to outreach, especially when it doesn't involve an ask. So when you're building a new relationship, the ability to say, like, we'd like to share with you who we are and what we're doing, is less, of concern to them than saying, we'd like to come talk to you about a funding opportunity. So being able to be clear that you're looking to build that relationship and be able to share your story is really key. The key is just picking up the phone. I mean, it's really what it boils down to in the end, is finding the folks that you want to be reaching out to and just starting to work that network, whether it's phone or email, in order to reach out and continue, and know that it can take a really long time. First, to get a response, and then to perhaps get the offer for the conversation. And so just being patient and not taking it personally and being diligent about it is really key. What I find is that most people who are uncomfortable with this part of the work need to actually budget the time to do it. They need to, set aside time that is not blended with all of the other things that you need to do for your organization, but where you can really focus on it. In the same way that Hannah has to have dedicated writing time, the picking up the phone and even asking your board, or whomever it might be, the current donor, for assistance, requires you really being thoughtful and not distracted. So building in that time is really key.
I saw that we have a question from Ariel.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really helpful. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how to handle the grant opportunities where there's a deliberate effort not to have any communication with people who are applying for grants for reasons of equity and other things. And because I remember, Brett, your point from the last session, that is, relationships are so key to this. And, for some of us don't yet have those relationships. So we're seeing these, requests for proposals, and we want to start reaching out. But so what do we do in those circumstances? And if we can't talk to them, also, how do we gauge our success potential?
Mm-hmm. Allie, Hannah, who wants to
I would say that. Yeah, I'll jump in quickly and then pass it to Hannah. In many cases, you're not going to have a conversation, and you've got to just go cold with it and see what the outcome is. Your best opportunity for the conversation then is after, if you're declined, to reach back out and say, we'd like to have a conversation with you about why. And they're more often willing to have that conversation than obviously at the front end. So I wish it were different. I wish that all foundations were, playing from the same card and were working with nonprofits to be able to submit the best proposal possible, but that's not the case. It's just not how they function. And we did have a couple examples this year where we had conversations with potential funders that said, we can't fund you. We just can't, because we're doubling down on our existing, but we're willing to help think about who else you should be reaching out to. And so making sure that you're leaning into those conversations is really important as well.
Allie, correct me if I'm wrong, but oftentimes foundations can't talk to you while they have an open RFP, but they can talk to you before the RFP opens. So Ariel, correct. In response to your question, frequently RFPs run at the same time each year, or they may be quarterly, right? But there is some predictability as to when RFPs run. Trying to get your question in before it opens can be helpful. The other thing I'll say is sometimes we had an application this past year that was cold with respect to the grants officer, but but we knew other people at the company. And so we had zero contact with the grants officer before we applied. We put in a cold application, but then we reached out to the people we knew at the company and said, hey, FYI, we submitted this. I have no idea if they helped us get that grant or not. But it was just another point of visibility and potential advocate in our corner when we were otherwise making a cold application. Does that help answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, Brett, I appreciate you adding that. And the one thing I would also add is that if you have a question that you really need guidance on during the RFP process and you can't speak to somebody in the funder's office, whether it's corporate or foundation, identifying like grantees who they funded previously and reaching out to colleague to colleague to say, hey, I know you've been funded by them before. I'm really stuck on this piece of it. Are you willing to talk through this with me? And I guarantee they would be willing to. It's you're not in competition. There's a lot of money to go around out there. And each cycle obviously is stressful for folks, but people tend to want to help one another put forward the best proposals possible. So, anything else from your perspective?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, you both have hit on this already a little bit, but leveraging any relationships you have that might be beneficial, right? So maybe you have a partnership with a previous grantee from a funder. So using that relationship also to maybe help bridge that communication gap if possible, and also to get some advice. So whatever it may be, it's always great to do your due diligence and to figure out what kind of angles you can work to help set you up for success.
How appropriate is it to leverage existing relationships that you've brought in from a prior organization you work with?
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have an organization with your current firm, but they knew your work at your last employer.
Yeah, that definitely is a case-by-case scenario. From a fundraiser's perspective, we are not supposed to be taking relationships from one nonprofit to another. And so I think most fundraisers, as they're moving organizations, will often wait to see if that funder maintains contact with them before they reciprocate and do so. That being said, I would say that you've got to have the right person make the outreach. So you've got to be careful, and you need to have the right person leverage that. So if you have a relationship with a funder that will have an interest in your organization's mission, but you're not necessarily the best person to do it because you've brought that relationship from somewhere else, finding somebody else in the board community who can champion that first step is really key.
And is it fair to say when you're leaving an organization, including your funders on the email list of people who receive your "I'm leaving, you can contact me at my next place," that's fine, so that the funder can initiate if they're interested in your next organization?
If they're interested. Yeah. When I was training staff, I would always say to folks, think of it as you have two Rolodexes, those old-fashioned Rolodexes on your desk. One is your personal one, and one is the organization's. And the organization stays behind. Like, it doesn't go with you. You need to truly leave those relationships there unless they make the outreach to you.
How do you reach out to people you don't know to facilitate introductions? So we talked about reaching out to other organizations they fund that you already know. Allie, you got to be brave 5 seconds at a time. How do you build up that bravery to reach out to organizations you don't know for help with introductions?
Yeah. So are you talking about somebody to help bridge the connection for you? Yeah. So often individual donors, I think, can be really helpful in this regard. If you know that there's somebody in your community who is giving to your organization or a similar mission to be able to reach out and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you about why you give, and help, ask for your help in thinking through how we might approach others. And what I find is, especially higher end donors, folks who would, put themselves in that philanthropist category, are willing to engage in those conversations. It's almost like, getting a feasibility study call from a nonprofit that might be in campaign planning. They're willing to share why they give and how they are connected within the community, so that you could perhaps use that step. But it's, again, just picking up the phone, calling people, researching who's giving to what, and just continue to kind of build those connections as the web grows.
You talked about using your board. How do you do that in practice?
Well, ideally, it's part of the board expectations. So if you have a board, whether you're at a university and it's a board, or it's an advisory board for your specific center or institute or nonprofit, building that into expectations for how they participate in the board is really key on the front end. I would ensure that fundraising and development is always a point of conversation in the board meetings and committee meetings, and that there's always a call to action, so that they leave every meeting knowing that there's a way for them to help you. And if necessary, actually bringing that list of, hey, folks, these are, the 4 that I'm really targeted on right now, and I need your help. Help build the strategy on this. Who do you know? Help me think this through. So whether it's in a group setting or one-on-one, just continuing to have those conversations with them and build that network.
And then acknowledging when they do help, so that everyone else sees someone else is helping. Maybe I should too. See a question from Tammy.
And
Go
celebrate
ahead.
it.
Yeah. Tammy?
Does it matter if you have a newer established nonprofit or LLC and you have a free email, right? A Gmail or those. I've noticed that those will be filtered, and that there are some, when you're looking at government RFPs, some won't even allow it. If you're looking at like DoD, is that the paid email and the website and those things, are those costs that affect, like, make it more likely for you not to get filtered out when you're doing cold emails to donors, or is that not so much a thing? Thinking
I
also
would say
just
it's
like
not so
your
much a thing.
typical prompts, right? Like, you don't want to send a copy paste generic email and
Right.
have it get in the spam as well.
Right. Yeah, I would say it's not so much an issue on the corporate foundation or individual side. I can't speak to the government side. It sounds like they already have those filters. And this is where the follow-up phone call is really key. So you sent the email, and if you haven't gotten a response, following up to say, I'm calling about this. And more often than not, if it's sitting in spam, they'll pull it out. But I have clients who use their personal email addresses for their little mom and pop, nonprofit that they've developed. So, and we haven't had issues with that, at least in this market.
And Allie, it can be uncomfortable to make those follow-up phone calls. How frequently do you make them?
That's a great question. So I had one donor. It took me 18 months to get in the door with. I called once a month for 18 months, and she finally said, just put this woman on my calendar. But she ended up being a fantastic donor, but it took that long. I tend to think once a month, but depending on the urgency, if there's a deadline looming, then you would want to pick up the pace and call every other week or once a week. So I would definitely, in the case of deadlines for proposal submission, increase that. But once a month is pretty consistent with what you would see across the industry.
And everyone, don't be shy about calling more than once. That is something I have learned from Allie that would not have occurred to me previously. All right, let's transition to our next topic, translating your work into grant language. Now, this is a topic that we'll touch on
Mm.
more lightly because most people at least did not rate this as the thing they were least comfortable with. What's the most important information to include in a funding request?
Yeah, so I can speak to this. So I would say the most important information to include in a funding request is the information they're asking you for, right? So what are their priorities for the funding request? Do they have a checklist of they want to serve this population? They want the program to be this many years old, whatever those key aspects are for them, you want to hit them and you want to hit them right away so that they know, okay, this organization that's submitting this request and their request fall within what we're going to fund. Something else that's very important, and this might seem kind of intuitive, but include quotes as much as you can. Quotes and impact stories. What you're really trying to do here
Mm.
after you've cultivated a relationship, or if you're just submitting an RFP for the first time, you're trying to create a sense of investment from a funder into your work, into your programs. And more often than not, that emotional response comes from moving quotes from participants or impact stories. Our program impacted this person this way. They took what, we helped them with and they did this with it. So I would say to hit that as much as possible. My rule of thumb would be at least one quote per question if that's the format for the RFP. But yes, so as much as you can,
Early and often, right, Hannah?
early and often.
Hannah and I always talk about make it
Yes.
explicit. Don't try to dance around it. Make it explicit how you're meeting their priorities, and then reinforce that throughout. Key reminder for everyone: the only way you can use quotes is if you're collecting them.
Mhm.
So make sure when you're doing your program evaluations and you're surveying participants that you're collecting those quotes, and that you're also asking questions of what did you do because of your participation, right? You're using that
Mm.
causal language so that when you're using those quotes, you can attribute the cause per their own attribution.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hannah, just a reminder from past workshops,
Right. No, thank you for
unrelated
adding.
here. Um, how do you go about translating your work into grant language? And some of this you already touched on, but anything more you want to say on this point, Hannah?
Yeah, well, something that I'll just say to keep in the back of your mind is, it's really helpful if you have the capacity and ability to kind of gauge what your funder's knowledge is, right? So, like I said before, doing that due diligence of who have they funded previously? Do they know the space? If I use certain acronyms, will they know what this means? Because that will really inform the language that you use. You might use some more public facing language that you would use in like a marketing and communications piece if the funder doesn't really know a lot about the field. But if they do, if they've funded a lot of your partners and they're really invested in this space, they know a lot about prevention, then you could use a little bit more technical knowledge. So that's one thing that I would really lean into when you're first creating that language is understanding, who are you speaking to and how do you speak their language? Um, so yeah, I mean that's the biggest thing that I would say for that.
And where's a good place to start when creating that language, Hannah?
So sometimes you will get like a set list of questions that kind of give you a flow for what you're going to say. And sometimes, a funder will just ask, I just want 2 pages on the work you do. So I'm actually going to send a kind of flow that helps me when I write in the chat for kind of setting things up and kind of giving consistency from one thing to the next. I'll touch on it very briefly since most people said that they were a little bit more comfortable with this. But where I start with this is creating an outline for each of these topics. So starting with the organization history and mission, how were you founded? What do you do? What populations you serve? What populations you serve is really key. And then going into setting up that problem or that need, what is this gap that we're trying to fill? What problem or need are we trying to addressing? And of course, are we trying to address, excuse me, and of course, using statistics and data to back up that problem as well as real world examples, right? This goes back to quotes or participant testimonials, or even, prominent examples of, the problem that you're addressing that they may have seen in the news, they might know about. So setting that up to kind of get them to understand what you're doing, what you're addressing. And then, of course, going into the project description, right? How are you addressing this problem or this need? And sometimes that might be the general organization. Our organization as a whole is doing this if you're applying for general operating support, or sometimes it'll be a very specific program. And then you can talk a little bit more about what that program is and those participants for that specific program. So that's where you give the nitty-gritty of what the funder will be funding, essentially. And then to build off of that, you want to set very concrete goals and outcomes. I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but it is always beneficial to follow the SMART acronym. So setting goals and outcomes that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So concrete numbers that you can hit within that period of performance. So if it's a 1 year grant, we can get this many participants in that 1 year, something of that nature, for an example. And then you want to talk about how you're going to show that you've achieved those goals and outcomes, right? So what systems do you have in place for evaluation? Do you collect surveys, or do you collect registration data? So what does that look like to be able to show the funder, this is what we're going to do to show that we've achieved these goals. And lastly, sustainability. And this is where you talk about after the period of performance, this is what we're going to do to continue our mission and our program. And so sometimes that'll look like, this funding will help us really, identify this population that needs this service. And then after the period of performance, we'll really drill into them on a smaller scale, and that will require less resources. So showing that continuity and how their funding will get you on a track to continue being successful. And this is also a good place to talk about, if you don't get the funds, what won't be able to be achieved? How will you not be able to meet this need? And that's where you can really highlight the urgency of that funding that you need from them to help fill this gap. So just going back through that, I know that was a lot, but so you want to start with your history and mission, your problem and need statement. Then you want to talk about the project description, your goals and outcomes, your evaluation methods, and sustainability for that program. And that's all in the chat. But that's kind of the flow that I use when I think through, okay, how are we going to set up this funding request?
Hannah and Allie, you've both made some references to different types of funding. A lot of people on this call will be mostly familiar with federal funding, which is frequently project-based funding. Oftentimes it needs to be a new project. And that's not true when looking at philanthropic funding. In fact, there can be capacity building awards or operational support. So Allie or Hannah, I defer to you on who wants to answer this. And I know it's off script, but can you just talk to the different types of funding that are available so people can organize their requests accordingly?
Yeah, Allie, do you want me to
jump in, Hannah, or you want me to?
I can start. So as Brett mentioned, there are a lot of different kinds of funding requests that philanthropic organizations will be looking for. Of course, like the gold star, like what is most desirable is often general operating support. This is typically unrestricted funding, and this is when you will frame this kind of funding request as going to support your organization as a whole. So all of your programs, everything that you need to keep your organization operational. As Brett said, there is also capacity building grants. So building up the capacity of your organization to further achieve your mission. And this might look like more staff capacity, um, or other things that increase your capacity. Ali, you can speak to this a little bit more. But so those are just two examples, in addition to project specific funding. So Ali, do you want to keep talking about some of the other kinds?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think drill in a little bit to the capacity building piece because I think that's a really great place to start. Doing searches to find funders who are willing to fund capacity building at the front end of your exploring funders is really key. And those are just they're fantastic because you literally can say, gosh, if we had marketing firm working with us, we could do X, Y, and Z. If we were able to, hire this program, manager, we can do this. And it gives you the ability to say, like, if we had these resources, it will move the needle for the organization in a dramatic way. And funders that are willing to do capacity building are often willing to continue operating type support later on. Folks that really prefer programmatic tend not to dip into that operating unless it's a very, very strong relationship, typically a longer term funding relationship. I would shift gears a little bit in terms of type of gifts as you're thinking about individual donors. Obviously, outright unrestricted is key, and relying on your annual fund, your appeals that are going out over the course of the year to be able to build that donor base is really key. We're seeing a lot of shift with donor advised funds and the ability to engage with folks that have, placed their resources, obviously, with either a financial institution or a community foundation. One of the tactics I really like to encourage clients to do is to schedule time with their local community foundations and ask for an opportunity to share information about the organization to the foundation staff who are working with the donors who have established the donor advised fund. So they're the intermediary. But what they then do is they've got you in their mental Rolodex, and as they're working with their donors and over the course of the year on how they're going to be distributing their resources, you may be top of mind when they come across somebody who has a particular passion that aligns with yours. And you would have never known that fund existed at that particular community foundation. So those donor advised funds are key. People are taking a lot of advantage of that for the tax purposes. So I think I'll stop there. The one thing I would add to actually, Hannah, to your earlier comments about the structure of the proposal and the way you think about it, I would encourage folks, make sure that you are distinguishing between outputs and outcomes. And yes, that it's not just this number of people and this number of whatever activities you're going to do, but what that actually means. And look at this, there's sunshine in Western Pennsylvania. Sorry. So shocking. So anyway, so distinguishing between those two, and if you have not been through the exercise of writing your theory of change model and doing a logic model, I would encourage you to start there. And we can share an example of that. I don't know, was that a standard piece, Brett, that's typically included in government? Okay.
For people who did federal funding, yes, absolutely, that was required. Okay. Not only that, but also implementation measurement plans. How are you going to measure your impact?
Yep.
So for those who have done that already, you have a leg up.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. And do it, you can do that logic model for each particular program and think about it that way. So just, something else I wanted to add in there. So.
All right. Neil gave me a chime check, which means we need to speed up. We're having too much fun. Okay. So aligning your mission with philanthropic priorities, how do you go about finding this alignment? And when in the process do you do this?
So I can speak to going about it, and then I think Allie, you can speak a little bit more to when you do this. Um, so the first thing that I would do is I would compare missions, right? I would look at your organization mission and the funder's mission and see where there's overlap. Maybe that's the population served, right? You serve similar populations. Um, Maybe it's a core value. That's key for overlap as well. So really looking at the two and Ali talked a little bit about this with the theory of change, but this is a great exercise to really drill down on your mission and how it impacts all of that programming that you have, to find that alignment and those key pieces of it that might,
Mm.
resonate with the funder. Um, and another place to really figure this out and, find that strategic alignment is looking at previous grantees of theirs, other organizations they funded, if they have missions that have some of those core components that are similar to yours, or other projects that they funded. Do these projects look similar to the projects that we funded? And that's a really great way to kind of find that mission alignment, I would say.
Allie, the other way we do this is indirect conversations and phone calls.
Yeah,
And we love it when they use our words in describing their
absolutely.
priorities for a specific funding kind of pillar of theirs. But speak to when in the process and the conversational element of this.
Yeah. So from an individual giving perspective, this goes to the cultivation and the qualification stage of being able to sit down with folks and just understand what their philanthropic priorities are. Not even as it specifically is your organization, but what are the other things that are important to you? And once you've got a sense of that, where do we fit within that? So, if they've got their church and their alma mater and their children's prep school or whatever, ahead of you, you know what you're contending with. And you can then have more detailed conversations about the alignment of their interest in your particular organization. But I think it's absolutely critical to understand your donors in a broader, comprehensive philanthropic manner. And that requires having conversations and asking questions and learning about them. Foundations put it out there a lot cleaner than others. And so corporations, it's often a very similar conversation to the individuals where you need to really be asking questions about what are your core values, as Hannah said, and being able to gain that information at the front end of the relationship. You don't want to get far along in a grant process and discover you haven't asked the right questions at the front end of it.
And Allie, one of the things I've learned from you is this can change year over year. So what are your priorities for this year, recognizing that they may be different from what they were the year before? All right, shifting gears. How do you gauge likelihood of success? And Allie, I'm going to ask you to speak to this from a fundraiser perspective, and then Hannah, you to speak to it from a grant writer perspective.
So from a fundraiser perspective, the best way to gauge it is to feel confident in your qualifications and ensuring that you've asked the right questions. Do you know their primary interest? Do you know what their potential budget is? Do you have a sense of what they want to fund? And do you know the timeline in which they intend to do that? And if you can answer those 4 questions, the likelihood of success is high. And if you don't know the answer to those questions, being able to continue conversations and gain more information is really key. In the corporate and foundation space, Brett, you said this earlier, the likelihood of success with existing donors is obviously higher. And so, as I think about a pipeline for an organization and the probability of success for the proposals that are in there, I do a weighting of these are folks who we have long history with and they continue to give, and I feel confident we're going to put those at 100%. here's somebody that we know nothing, they don't know anything about us. We're completely a cold submission, and it's maybe got a 5 or 10% chance. And being able to build out your pipeline that way and determine, do you have enough in the pipeline to actually meet the goal? So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, and something I'll just say before I answer your question, Brett, is there's kind of a little bit of a theme here, right? Ali is talking more so about these questions as it relates to building relationships with funders and having the opportunity to talk to them face to face, which is something that myself as a grant writer, I'm not always a part of those conversations. And, Ariel, as you said, sometimes you're not able to have a conversation with funders. And so, how do you gauge your likelihood of success when those conversations are not feasible, which is sometimes the case? And so, what I would say is going back to that checklist, right, of priorities that the funder has for this funding request, looking at it and saying, okay, where do I fit into this? Do I check off everything that they're looking for from, as I've said before, population served to core values to my organization has been around for this long to our budget fits within, the scope of the size of an organization they're trying to fund. And I would say the more on that checklist that you kind of fall into, the higher your likelihood of success when you don't have the ability to build that previous relationship.
All right. And how do you gauge that ROI? Is it worth it to even submit the application? Ali, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah. So, it depends on obviously being able to track if you've got somebody on staff who's writing grants for you versus if you're using outside counsel, knowing what your cost is associated with it. I really encourage folks to keep a pulse on those success rates and be able to, just because somebody writes really well and uses your language doesn't mean that they necessarily have the success of those grants actually being funded. And so in many cases, nonprofits have multiple grant writers that they're kind of working through at any given time. And it's okay to shift around. The going rate for grant writers varies across the country, but if you don't have somebody dedicated to doing this for you and you're an executive director and you've got all these other things on your plate, I think it's absolutely worth it to contract with somebody and be able to have somebody else supporting you through this process, because it can be cumbersome. It can pull you away from a lot of the day-to-day stuff that you need to be doing.
Yeah. And just building off of that, as Ali touched on a little bit, this is really where you need to not only gauge what resources you have, but your capacity to be able to do this to the best of your ability. And sometimes, a funding request will be really lengthy. And, you're not sure you have a super high success rate. So then it might not be worth it. But if you do have the capacity, and Ali and I have talked about this before, it's always beneficial to, submit because it gets you on that funder's radar. Even if, you might not have a high likelihood of success this time, it gets your foot in the door. They might know who you are now, and there's that capacity to kind of reach out to them and further build that relationship. And then maybe that would lead towards some funding in the future. So if you have the capacity, my opinion would be it's always better to submit than not.
And part of this is also planning to have that capacity, recognizing that foundations frequently schedule or follow a repeatable schedule, planning ahead with any contract grant writer team that you have to ensure that you've got capacity in the times when proposals are likely to be open. All right, final topic. Submitting an actual proposal. Is it okay to submit a proposal once you've gauged a low likelihood of success? Hannah, you just spoke to this a little bit, but over to you.
Ali, do you want to touch on this since I just talked about it a little bit?
Sorry, I was reading the questions in the chat.
So I will answer for Ali. Yes, even if you have a low likelihood of success, If you've
Yes.
got the
Yes.
capacity and it's not too expensive, it gets you on their radar
Submit.
and opens the door to create a relationship.
Yes.
Absolutely. And you have the ability to ask for feedback on the back end.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brett.
Is it okay to submit a proposal without prior cultivation? We've answered this a lot already, but yes. All right, Hannah, I'm calling on you for Humera's question because you started grant writing for us in May and you are already brilliant at it. So Humera asks, how long does it take to get grant writers up to speed on the topic so they can write more relevant content? Now, granted, Hannah had interned with us for a year before she became a grant writer, so that's not a true test. But how long does it take to get up to speed on writing grants on this topic?
Yeah, I would say it's different depending on what you're writing about, right? Some topics are more technical than others, especially in this field, right? Prevention, with a public health approach does have some technical elements to it. I'll say from my perspective that as a grant writer, before I stepped into this position, I was able to kind of observe Eradicate Hate's programming, and join in on a lot of their calls. So if you give a grant writer an opportunity to kind of sit in and be a part of the team, then I would think they would be able to get up to speed and get comfortable with that language relatively quickly. Not in a couple days, but in a couple weeks after, really soaking in that environment and, what everyone is doing. And, I'm going to also emphasize that every grant application is a team effort. So even if you, as the grant writer, are spearheading it and you're creating the content, you always want team feedback on it. And that also really helps get a grant writer up to speed, right? It's getting feedback from the team on, maybe use this language a little bit differently, things like that. I hope that helps you, Mara.
Also collecting past applications that you've submitted so that any new grant writer has a chance to learn from how you've positioned yourself previously. All of these things are helpful. I think our last two grant writers, I think Michaela was perhaps unique in the fact that she was probably up to speed in 2 weeks. But she did sit in with our team on every single call for those 2 weeks, not just preparing as an outside grant writer, but truly absorbing how we use language. I would say, to Hannah's point, maybe 1 to 3 months for someone who's not extraordinary. Okay, excellent questions from Tammy. About applying as a coalition. Allie, I'm gonna toss these to you.
Yeah, I love this question. Right now, it is more important than ever. Funders, especially foundations, want to see like organizations coming together and bringing forward a request that would impact even on a greater scale. So just because an RFP or a funder, doesn't explicitly state that they're looking for a partner submission, don't shy away from stepping into that space yourself and bringing it forward. And I do think it's important for all parties to be involved. There can be different levels of involvement. Some, you may decide that one's really going to take the lead on the crafting, while somebody else might be the lead on, on the back end in terms of the grant, completion and actually implementation of it. So just being able to work to determine that on the front end is really helpful. If you are going in as a partner organization, I would give consideration to who's been funded by them previously, if that's the case. Obviously, using that as the lead, but also you need to think through opportunities for if you're going to have to end up subcontracting the second organization, like what that looks like. So there are financial considerations and modeling that you would want to make sure you've got in place before bringing forward that recommendation. But funders, I would say across the board, foundations especially, but individuals and foundations, we're seeing a trend where they really like seeing people come together on this. And in some markets where there is, an abundance of nonprofits doing similar work, it's more important to do that.
And Allie, there are questions here on the relationship building, whether you do that alone and represent that you're partnering with other organizations or whether you bring them in at every stage of the process. Really depends, but just wanted to call out some of those
Absolutely.
questions.
Yeah, definitely depends. Again, if you have the existing relationship and it's not going to be a necessary step to introduce additional folks, then I would not take that step. But for the most part, I would say that, most funders are going to want to know both sides of who's implementing and responsible for the funding. Yeah.
And sometimes the best
happy.
primary applicant might not be you. It may be one of your partners, even if you're the one with the capacity to help write the grant. So it's also important to choose the best primary applicant based on alignment, even if that's not you. But agree to that work sharing and cost sharing in advance. Okay.
Yeah, so
go ahead, Allie.
I was just going to say, I saw Humera's comment. We're happy to share some recommendations for grant writers, but also Steve's question around vetting and choosing. Obviously, talking to your nonprofit colleagues and finding out who they're using and asking those questions can be really helpful just for recommendations. To Brett's earlier point, it's got to be somebody who can pick up your language, your field, your terminology, all of that, and for whom you're comfortable writing on your behalf. And so it's got to feel like a good fit. And asking for, just examples of writing and being able to see what they've done. But my sense is that if you find an organization that has had success receiving a lot of grants, they're going to be willing to share with you recommendations for other grant writers that can support you.
I would also wonder, Allie, does it make sense to potentially partner with a new grant writer on a low stakes submission so you can see how they adapt to your language and how they navigate it in low stakes opportunities before those high stakes opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great recommendation, Brett.
All right, and Humera is taking you up on recommendations, which we're happy to provide, Humera. Any other questions?
Do Did we lose Brett?
I'm here. Did I freeze?
You did.
Your audio cut out for a second.
Oh, I was asking if there were any other questions. I'll stay off video for the purposes of better audio. All right, well, people think if there are other questions, I'm going to ask Neil there we go, he's ahead of me as always, populate the survey. So as we mentioned, in order to be able to communicate your impact and write effective proposals, you need to be able to collect impact data from participants. So please take a moment to complete this survey. Please use surveys when running your own programs. And if there are any additional questions while people are completing the survey, by all means, we're happy to chime in and answer. Can we cover some fundraising stuff as possible? Humera, tell us what you're asking.
So grants are one thing, right? You have an RFP and you respond to it. But sometimes you actually have programs that you want to get funding for, and it's outside of grant systems, right? And you're approaching sort of cold, but you're asking to do something new. So it's not the same as looking for a grant, but sometimes you're looking for actually just funding. I guess you call it gifts. But they're very structured, very specific. And I guess it's not just approaching individuals, but also organizations for it. And I was just wondering, is there better ways of structuring it? Usually that gets covered underneath like fundraising strategies and stuff, but this is something very specific to programs.
Okay. I would say knowing what funders are funding outside the context of an RFP. So foundations will often have multiple buckets from which they fund. One that might be tied directly to an RFP and other resources that are available on an ongoing basis based on their particular areas of support. And so in those cases, continuing to build the relationships with the funders as if they were individuals, where you're saying, hey, we've got this great idea and we'd like to come present this to you, even though it's not within the context of their an RFP that they might have put out on something else, as long as you know that it's aligned to that funder. I would say corporations are very much in this space. Corporate partners. And so if you've got a project that you think aligns with an entity that from a corporate standpoint could be stepping into space, scheduling to be able to present those projects and be able to, bring it forward as opposed to it being reactive to an RFP. I think, Humira, the sense is that grants are only RFP related, and they're not. Like in this space, and I know you all know that, but there are so many funders that fund outside of RFPs, and just on an annual basis, maintaining that relationship so that you can bring forward the programs that are of most interest or most need for your organization at any given time. Keeping them informed is really key, getting them excited about them, even when you're not asking, just informing them.
What are examples of roles or titles at community foundations or other philanthropic organizations that are most appropriate to reach out to build relationships?
Program officers, they might be called donor services, like the donor services department within a community foundation. I know that's what they call them here at the Pittsburgh Foundation. We also have a group called the Grant Makers of Western Pennsylvania, which is all of the local funders, and they get together and regularly have programming. And like Humira, this is a great place where like you could build a relationship with the folks at that funders network and have the opportunity to present a program to a variety of funders. And we've had that happen actually with Eradicate Hate over the course of the last year, which was fruitful. But I would say, like I said, program officers, donor services, corporate social responsibility is the term that you're seeing most in the corporate space in terms of, or community relations, folks that are overseeing the funds if they don't have a specific foundation within that corporation.
Yeah, and also just quickly, Allie, to build off of that a little bit, at some larger organizations, sometimes they'll have program officers that are specifically focused on a field that's relevant to you. So if you are able to identify who that is, there might be a democracy program officer or a counterterrorism program officer that would be best to build that kind of relationship with.
All right. Any final questions? Please join me in thanking Allie Quick and Hannah Mayer for this excellent workshop. If you're not already familiar with the Prevention Practitioners Network, Neil Saw will put his email in the chat. Please reach out to him if you want, or just register on our website if you want to be informed about future workshops. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. Farewell.
Thanks, you guys.
Thanks,
Please take
everyone.
that survey if you have not. And thank you, Allie and Hannah. Bye, you
Thanks
guys.
for having us, Neil.
Thank you.